Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fector,
business columnist and editor Greg Jefferson,
investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff.
And if we sound a little bit tired, this is the morning after the 2020 general election, and I don't want to bury the lead here. So it is the morning after the election, and we don't know who our next president's going to be. And that's going to be the first thing we're going to talk about. There's a lot to say about what happened in Bexar County and in Texas in the election. But the story that everyone in the country is following is this really close presidential race. There had been thoughts based on some polling that Joe Biden might have a comfortable win. James Carville, the Democratic operative, had predicted that he would pop a bottle of champagne on election night because he was very confident that it would be a comfortable win. And it's not turning out that way. But at the moment, Joe Biden has a pretty solid path to victory if he can maintain his close leads in Arizona and Nevada and win Michigan and Wisconsin. Those states look pretty good for him. He can get to 270 electoral votes without winning Pennsylvania and Georgia, both of which are being have Donald Trump in the lead right now. So I just wanted to get obviously this is a pretty amazing turn of events, and we're waiting. We're going to have to wait for mail ballots, and we don't know exactly when we're going to know who the next president is. Greg, what is your reaction? How surprised?
It's funny. Yeah, it's funny. I'm surprised like everybody else, but I'm also surprised that I'm surprised. I mean, if you go back 2 or 3 months, like, wasn't this the scenario we kind of knew was going to play out? I mean, right. This seems familiar. Like the closeness of this race, we almost took for granted over the summer, but it seemed like the closer we got to election day, and we got caught up in just the incredible turnout for early voting. And I think that gave Democrats and progressives the feeling that the wind was at their back. And that just wasn't the case. I mean, a lot of the people who were coming to the polls, who maybe were new to voting, a lot of them were Trump supporters, more so I think than progressives assumed. So yeah, I mean it's surprising, but it probably shouldn't have been. I mean, it also feels like we're in a very fragile position. I mean, and I'm talking about like in a big sense, like as far as like society is in a very fragile position in the next few days.
That's right, and I mean, yeah, you feel like and Trump certainly is kind of he's throwing wood on the fire now by talking. Yeah. And I think that I think you could sense that even some Republicans were nervous about that. He's got a little more pushback than usual from his fellow Republicans, because I think people are nervous that we're in a really precarious position right now as we wait. It's not in our nature to want to wait as long as we might have to in this case. Josh, what did you make of the results?
So I may be getting ahead of myself here, but top line, like there are two people you don't want to be right now, and their names are John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. It seems like that's. This election, may increasingly sort of fall on their shoulders. I mean, we'll see how Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania all turn out. But I mean, the president has promised, legal challenges and all that. But I want to take us to Texas here. For the umpteenth time, Democrats said, we're going to flip Texas. We're going to turn it blue. They improved on their margins at the presidential level, but obviously Texas still went for Trump, and I think it's just like incredibly interesting that like this kind of tends to be sort of how they think about this, is that, hey, look, like, this is a non-voting state. It's not a Republican state, and yet you had sort of this record turnout in Texas. That doesn't that doesn't hold true. And I also wonder, like, do Democrats have like a really difficult time talking to Republicans? I remember, a couple weeks back, I went and talked to people in Alamo Heights and Terrell Hills and surrounding neighborhoods, folks that traditionally vote Republican. They told me that, a lot of them told me that they were going to vote for Biden at the top of the ticket and, vote for Republicans down the ballot to some degree. I don't think Democrats know how to talk to those voters.
Yeah, well, this is a great point because I've said for years, and the situations aren't exactly parallel, but obviously Ronald Reagan and his emergence as a national figure, beginning in the '76 presidential race, and then again in 1980, he had a lot to do with Texas flipping from Democrat to Republican. And one of the things he did was he had been a former Democrat. He would always say, to my Democratic friends, basically, your party, has left you behind. Come and join us. We want you. And so there was always this sense that, we want you to be part of what we're doing. And I think that some Democrats do that, but I think that there is sometimes a tendency among Democrats to think the other side, those people are so awful. How could they vote for Trump? Who wants them, and I'm not saying political candidates say that, but I think there's a little bit of that sensibility within the party. And I think it almost has to change somewhat. And it's a tough balancing act because you could alienate some progressive Democrats if you're perceived as trying too hard to win over Republicans. Brian, I want to get, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, the other thing I was thinking about on this, in terms of trying to persuade Republicans is, there's been a lot of chatter on sort of lefty Twitter today, a lot of finger pointing going like, well, this is kind of what happens when you go for the candidate you think is going to win versus the candidate you actually support and want to see sort of enact policies and everything. What that argument runs into is the fact that the Democratic Party overwhelmingly chose Joe Biden as their candidate.
It wasn't the party, this establishment. It was the voters in the primaries. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it's like like that argument just kind of falls apart, especially given that like a lot of, Republicans that I've talked to or conservative leaning voters I talked to that did wind up casting a vote for Biden. And, I'm taking this and extrapolating out. But I mean, they told me that this would be a much harder decision for them if they had to choose between a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren versus Donald Trump.
That's interesting. Right. Hey, Brian, what stood out to you about the election?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of what surprised me and what didn't surprise me, I don't think it's a surprise that the way that the president is reacting to the close race on the national level, with the continued demonization of mail ballots and even his declaration of victory last night was telegraphed a few days in advance. I think what
Sure.
surprised me again, I think it goes to Texas. I mean, I did not expect Biden to take Texas, but I did expect him to perform better in Texas, especially in the Valley. I don't think we've touched on that yet, but he way underperformed Hillary Clinton in the Valley.
That's, and it's an interesting thing because Biden, even in the Democratic primaries, didn't do that well with Latino voters. Bernie Sanders seemed to have a connection with Latinos that Joe Biden was never able to get. And he did underperform. I mean, what happened in the Valley, which is those counties down there have been overwhelmingly Democratic over the years. At the same time, as someone from the Valley, I know that that the Valley is more complicated than maybe some pundits think. I mean, there are people, Latinos on the border who are very hawkish about the border and have some very negative views about undocumented immigrants from Mexico. There are also a lot of people in the Valley who are, very supportive of law enforcement. And so Trump's talk about backing the blue was, I think, meant something to him. Also, he's presented himself as the pro-business candidate, so I think that's part of it.
And also, the Biden campaign didn't really treat Texas like a battleground.
That's right.
Even though the media and the pundits, were saying it was.
The media.
Like we're the media, but
the enemies of the state, basically. The thing is about it, like I think, I mean, there's kind of a school of thought that it was a disastrous night for Democrats in Texas. I don't really think it was that bad. I think that it was in the expectations game. They did very poorly because I think they set expectations too high. They thought they were going to flip 9 Texas House seats. Basically, they'd be able to flip all the House seats that Beto O'Rourke carried in 2018. And I don't think Beto O'Rourke's appeal necessarily translates to all these House candidates. And so Trey Martinez Fisher from San Antonio had filed for Texas House Speaker last week because he was so confident that they were going to gain control of the House. So I think that the expectations were really high. I personally, like you, Brian, I think all of us kind of felt that it was unlikely that Biden would win Texas, though we thought maybe he'd get closer. I never thought MJ Hagar was going to beat John Cornyn for the Senate. I was skeptical that Wendy Davis could beat Chip Roy for Congress. So a lot of these played out kind of the way I thought, if the numbers were not quite there. But I think Democrats had they set the expectations really high. One that really stood out to me as I think a bitter disappointment for Democrats was Texas U.S. District 23, which Will Hurd is leaving after 3 terms. It was an open seat. You had Gina Ortiz-Jones, the Democratic candidate. She got within 926 votes of beating Will Hurd 2 years ago. She came back really well funded, high name ID, and she's running against a first time candidate named Tony Gonzalez, who barely escaped with a primary runoff win. So he started his campaign late. This looked like this was the Democrats were just already assuming they were going to flip this seat, and Tony Gonzalez won by a pretty comfortable margin. And one of the things I'm kind of curious to get everybody's thoughts on, I think Trump has shown he's kind of impervious to polls. Polls just don't seem to kind of capture whatever he's what's happening out there with the public. But also, I think that while many people looked and saw Trump and said, his handling of the pandemic showed incompetence or recklessness and so on, there were I think some of his supporters who thought, well, he's out there saying we need to open everything up again. That's more of a rousing message than the nuanced message of Biden. And by the same token, I think Tony Gonzalez, he went out there, campaigned all over the district and made a big show of it. Gina Ortiz-Jones was trying to follow the science and doing a virtual campaign. And kind of gambling that the voters would say, hey, she's being the responsible one.
It's really
here.
a drag to be burdened by science, isn't it?
But you get into that thing where, like, a lot, I think there is a political risk in doing what she did. Although I think you could say that it was probably the responsible thing, but he was out there and he was meeting people, and that counts for a lot. And in the same way that Trump was doing more of an out there campaign than Joe Biden. I mean, any thoughts on District 23?
Her campaign seemed, just looking at it from the outside, it looked fairly lackadaisical. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that, she was not doing in-person meetings. There were no rallies. A lot, most of her campaigning, at least in large groups, was virtual. But I also wonder, how much of it had to do with, maybe she just took too much for granted. Coming into this race, she had done so well and came so close against Will Hurd 2 years ago. I think she thought that was good juju she'd banked and could count on this time around, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, there was never. It's a hard thing to define, and part of it was probably the pandemic and the way it affected campaigning. But I never sensed that there was the energy behind her campaign or the passion among her supporters that you felt 2 years ago. And maybe it was because she was the underdog then and a first-time candidate. And so that was I think one that Democrats are really going to be looking at as a lost opportunity.
And just really quick, you've written several times about Tony Gonzalez's. Basically, misinformation about Jones not living in the district, being a DC resident. Do you think that had much bearing at all on the result?
I think it resonated to some degree, and it was totally false. But I think that he started this hashtag, "Where's Gina?" And the fact is that she wasn't around. I mean, she conceded during a primary. I mean, during a debate that from about March on up till maybe early October, she didn't really do any in-person campaigning. She was doing virtual town halls, and they were doing phone banking and so on. So when he's putting that out there, where is she? She doesn't live here. And she's not around very much to really, debunk that. Mm-hmm. I think it took hold, and I think that just the general, I think even some Democrats have mentioned to me that, and it was complicated by the pandemic. I understand that, but voters do want to see that you really want it, and they want to see you come out there. And so I think that's that one was one that I think could have been won. When I look at, Democrats didn't gain any state house seats, which they thought they were going to be able to do. They gained one state Senate seat, as far as I know, which was Roland Gutierrez from San Antonio, kind of flipping back a seat that had gone Republican in a special election. But Texas 23 is the one that really stands out to me. I wanted to talk a little bit about the what happened with the propositions in San Antonio, because those were ones that we gave a lot of attention to. And Josh, you've covered this the most. If you could just talk a little bit about what these propositions were all about, and what happened in the election.
Yes. So we had a trio of propositions, sales tax propositions on the ballot here in San Antonio. One to renew pre-K, the city's early childhood education program. Then two more. One backed by the mayor to use a 1/8 cent sales tax to basically pay for workforce development, job training, college degrees for folks who had lost their jobs because of the pandemic. You also had VIA on the ballot. They were also seeking the 1/8 cent sales tax, although that's not going to kick in until January 2026 to basically fund expanded bus service, 4 to 5 years from now. And what you saw was, pretty early in the night, a pretty resounding, overwhelming kind of victory for all three propositions. The most of which went to, the mayor's workforce campaign. He came away with, more than 3/4 of the vote on workforce, despite some of these criticisms that, maybe the plan wasn't sort of ready to go. The city's current workforce program had gotten off to a shaky start. And that, this was, replacing, and taking away sort of the sales tax funding for aquifer protection and linear parks and creekways, that had overwhelmingly been approved by voters in the past. So, it seems like a pretty big night for the mayor. He kind of made himself the face of the workforce campaign. Right. I was looking at, last night, I just went back and I was looking at, sort of all of his margins and the percent of the vote that he's gotten in past elections. This is the best election he's ever had. The second best comes in, in 2015 when he's reelected to council, for the first time he's reelected. That was like a 72% margin he had. But every other race he's had since then has been close and had to go to a runoff. So
does a Greg Brockhouse who ran against him last year and has been rumored to be interested again, does he look at it? Greg Brockhouse strongly opposed the VIA proposition and also was opposed to the workforce development initiative. Does he come away from this thinking there's no path for me, or does it make any difference?
Yeah, actually, I was on KSAT's live stream last night, and they brought Brockhouse on, and I asked him that. And
great.
Yeah. And so basically the takeaway is, hey, he's just one guy. how could one guy possibly affect this, stop this juggernaut, this $1 million juggernaut behind these three? And it's like, never mind that this one guy almost became mayor 2 years ago. I mean, he was almost elected mayor. So anyway, he says that, it's not going to dissuade him from running for mayor. I mean, he obviously hasn't committed. I got, just in talking with him last night, I got the sense that, that seems to be the direction he's leaning in, to run against Nuremberg. But yeah, I don't think he saw the victory of these three propositions as instructive for him at all.
When it comes to him. Well, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Head over to expressnews.com to check out our all-new podcast page where you can find more great San Antonio-focused podcasts such as Express Briefing, where we bring you the top headlines for the day in about 10 minutes or less.
Well, we're back, and before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk a little bit about the county commissioner race in Precinct 3. This was a really interesting race where you had Trish DeBerry, the Republican public relations consultant, running against Christine Hordick, Democratic attorney. And Brian, this is you wrote about this race, and this is one that a few months ago I think we would have just thought this is an automatic win for Trish DeBerry. It hasn't really been competitive. It's been a solid Republican precinct, and you wrote about some issues that Trish DeBerry had, and which caused the editorial board to make the unusual move of revoking their endorsement and giving it to Christine Hordick. Trish DeBerry won, but it was I think maybe about an 8 or 9% margin. Certainly closer than we're used to there. I mean, what was your takeaway there, and what stood out to you about that race?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it was closer than it should have been, considering the traditional, leaning Republican nature of that precinct, which is it's a huge swath of the north side. I think that the Hortick campaign was initially heartened by the numbers of apparent Democrats and independents and new voters who turned out early. I think there was recognition that the turnout on election day was ultimately going to decide this race, and sort of it just didn't happen for Hortick on election day. Trish just increased her margin of victory because Trish came out ahead in early voting anyway. So, and with Trish's issues with her public contracts, what I had reported last month was that despite Trish promising over the summer not to pursue any public contracts, because of course she's CEO of a very well-connected public relations firm. She has contracts with the San Antonio water system, Brooks, to name a couple. These are governmental entities that are associated with the county, and that the county does, for example, fund projects at Brooks. But in any case, she had promised last summer to not pursue any public contracts if she gets elected. But then I reported that last month, granted, she hadn't been elected yet, but even while early voting was taking place, she renewed 2 contracts with Saws and Brooks. So there's questions about whether or not this is going to create conflicts of interest for DeBerry when she becomes commissioner. And Christine was hoping that would eat away at Trish's support, which, by the way, is vast among the business community. Trish eclipsed Hortick in fundraising, and she has the support of business leaders across the city.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing is going to be is to see whether she severs those contracts now that she has won. I mean, I think the argument she probably would have made before was that since she hadn't been elected yet, she was maintaining them. But I think that's going to be the interesting thing. And
that's unclear. What she had said also was that if there's a real or perceived conflict of interest with any of these public contracts, she would sever them. But then when I asked her during early voting whether she would do so for the Saws contract and the Brooks contract that she had just renewed, she was arguing that it's not a conflict because there's no, quote, county oversight of those entities. So it's an open question still. She was very vague and wishy-washy about the whole situation, which is exactly why the editorial board rescinded its endorsement of her. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to wrap things up there. I want to thank you all for listening, and hopefully by the time we're back with you next week, we will know who won the presidential election. That would be really nice. So hope you all are doing well. Take care, and we'll talk with you next week.